Ever feel like you're trying to assemble this massive puzzle?
Yeah.
Way too many pieces, and the picture just keeps shifting.
Oh, absolutely. That's just trying to keep up these days, isn't it? Information overload.
Totally. But what if, like, we could find a shortcut? Not by skipping the hard stuff, but finding those hidden connections, the bits that make it all just click.
Well, that's exactly what we try to do with these deep dives, right? And today we're tackling something pretty ambitious, submitted by our learner.
Right, this unified quantum information network theory.
That's the one. We've got their personal reflections, a really detailed theoretical document.
And even questions about testing it, falsifiability, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So our mission really is to dig through all this fascinating material.
Pull out the core insights.
Yeah, find those connections, those aha moments, make these big ideas maybe a bit more accessible and see where it leads. Could tell us something about reality itself.
Okay, a unified quantum information network theory. Phew. Sounds like deep waters right off the bat. Our learner's clearly been wrestling with some really fundamental questions here.
You can see that. From intuitive leaps to the formal structure and then grappling with the science bit.
So with something this huge, where do we even, begin?
I think of the most fundamental idea, the real cornerstone, is a perspective shift.
Okay.
So instead of seeing reality as built from, say, little particles bouncing around,
Usual picture.
right, it proposes reality emerges from a universal quantum information network.
The network.
Yeah, think of this immense interconnected web. Relationships and how information gets processed, those are the primary ingredients. Not the stuff itself, but the connections.
A cosmic web of information.
So less about the individual bits and more how they relate, what those relationships do.
Precisely.
The learner's notes mentions something intriguing, a contextual hypergraph query engine. What's the plain English on that?
Okay, let's break it down. Imagine a really complex network that's the hypergraph.
More complex than just point to point. Yeah, exactly. Unlike a regular graph with just pairs connected, a hypergraph lets you connect groups of points all at once. Think like a social network, but connecting whole circles of friends, not just individuals.
Got it. Groups connected.
Now, the query part is like an interaction and observation happening within that network.
Okay.
But the key word is contextual. The outcome of that query, the reality what we experience, isn't fixed. It actually depends on the specific context within the hypergraph. Meaning who or what else is involved in that interaction? What are their connections right at that moment? It all influences the answer you get. So the big insight, reality isn't some static thing out there. It's actively shaped by these interactions and all the surrounding information.
So reality is like asking a question, and the answer depends entirely on who you ask, where you ask it, what's going on around them.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Very different thinking.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the learner has this fascinating line. Objective reality can be seen as the interference patterns of subjective linear observations.
That sounds almost musical.
It does, doesn't it? Subjective linear reality. That's basically your unique first-person experience. The stream of your consciousness, right?
On perspective.
Exactly. This theory suggests that what we perceive as objective reality, the solid world we mostly agree on.
The shared world.
Right. It actually arises from how all these individual subjective experiences, these sort of waves of observation, interact. They interfere.
Like ripples in a pond crossing each other.
Kind of like that.
Yeah.
Where our individual perspectives align or interfere constructively, we get a stronger shared sense of reality.
Wow.
So the crucial takeaway is, our experiences aren't just passive recordings, they're actively contributing to the reality we all perceive.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. It sounds like consciousness isn't just watching the show, it's involved in making it.
That's a core implication, yes. The learner's notes talk about a conscious boundary. What's the idea there?
Well, think about the simple act of observing something, anything.
Okay.
The moment you do that, you're creating a separation, right? There's you, the observer, and it, the observed.
Subject and object.
Exactly. The theory proposes that this act, drawing that boundary, creating an inside and an outside, it isn't just some mechanical process that happens.
Well?
No, it's presented as a fundamental act of consciousness. The idea is there are no inherent separations, no truly distinct things until consciousness makes that distinction, establishes that boundary, that specific viewpoint, that relationship.
Whoa. So the lines we draw, the divisions we see, they aren't just in the universe. We sort of create them by looking.
That's the essence of it.
And how does this tie back to that hypergraph thing, the network?
It fits perfectly. The underlying structure of reality, whether you're thinking about abstract concepts or fundamental quantum particles, is this relational hypergraph.
Right.
And what's really significant, again, is the emphasis on relationships. The theory pushes this idea that the connections between things are actually more fundamental than the individual things being connected.
It's like saying the internet is more real than the individual computers plugged into it. Is that too simple?
No, that's actually a really apt analogy. It captures the spirit.
Okay.
And the learner actually quotes something relevant here. Entanglement shows that relationships between particles can be more fundamental than the particles themselves, exactly as your hypergraph theory suggests.
Entanglement. Quantum spookiness.
Right.
Yeah.
Where two particles get linked, instantly connected no matter how far apart. It strongly hints, doesn't it, at some deeper interconnectedness that our usual picture of separate objects just doesn't capture.
It really does challenge that classical view.
Okay.
Okay, so we have this fundamental network, all relationships,
Right.
and consciousness is actively drawing lines, creating perspectives within it. How did this whole thing even start then? The learner mentions a primordial query.
Mm-hmm. The theory speculates that the universe kicks off with a foundational act of self-distinction, a kind of primordial question asked by consciousness itself.
Literally a question.
Not necessarily in words, but the fundamental act of, who am I? The very first division, the initial boundary creating self from other, or maybe just this from that.
First distinction.
Exactly. Think of it like dropping a pebble into a perfectly still pond. That first ripple.
It sets everything else in motion.
That's the idea. That first query, that first distinction sets off a chain reaction.
And this single act leads to everything, all the complexity.
That's the proposal. The answer to that initial query forms the basis for the next query and the next. It becomes this recursive process.
Like those cellular automata things.
Yeah.
Generating patterns.
Very much like that, yeah. Simple rules, repeated, leading to incredible complexity. It's consciousness essentially exploring itself through this ever-expanding web of distinctions and relationships.
Okay, my head's spinning a bit, but in a good way. This feels like zooming out to the absolute biggest picture.
It is a very zoomed-out perspective.
The learner also talks about the universe as a single, interconnected quantum system. A universal wave function.
Yes.
It's very unified.
It is. The idea is to imagine the entire universe as one vast quantum entity. Everything fundamentally linked at some level.
Everything connected.
Yes. And this universal wave function, it doesn't just list all the possibilities for everything. It emphasizes the deep interdependencies between them all.
Okay.
And here's a really key insight from the notes. Composite systems within this big wave function, because of entanglement, they contain more information than just adding up their individual parts.
Oh, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but like quantifiably.
Exactly. It's in those relationships, that interconnectedness, that the real complexity and maybe novelty emerges.
Right, so entanglement isn't just weird, it's where the extra information lives.
That's one way to think about it.
Then the learner introduces this. Information entanglement field. You mentioned the Higgs field analogy earlier.
Yes, that's a helpful comparison the learner draws. Just like the Higgs gives particles mass by interacting with them.
This information field interacts with what?
It's proposed to permeate all of space and essentially entangle particles across what physicists call Hilbert space.
Hilbert space.
Okay, remark. Think of it as a huge abstract space that contains all the possible quantum states a system could be in. It's the mathematical playground for quantum mechanics.
Right, the space of possibilities.
So this information field acts like a background network within that possibility space. It subtly influences the probabilities of quantum events, nudging them within their allowed quantum rules.
So it doesn't break physics, but it kind of guides things. A gentle nudge.
Guides, influences, coordinates, especially in complex systems. It's proposed as a mechanism for relational learning and memory within the network.
Interesting. That could potentially explain some of the self-organizing patterns we see.
Potentially, yes.
The learner also brings up resonance, like tuning forks or guitar strings vibrating together. How does that fit?
Resonance offers a really compelling model for non-local influence here, things affecting each other without touching.
Without sending a signal in the usual way.
Exactly. If systems vibrate at matching frequencies, they can influence each other across distances. No direct energy or information packet needs to travel between them in the classical sense.
Like sympathetic vibration.
Precisely. And the theory makes a distinction. There might be distance-independent resonance, like maybe why all electrons have the same properties everywhere.
Universal harmonics.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And then distance-dependent resonance, which would be more like patterns propagating through the network, affecting things nearby more strongly.
That makes intuitive sense. Okay, but what about time? We experience it constantly. The learner suggests it might not be fundamental at all. That's mind-bending.
It really is. The theory proposes time isn't a primary dimension like space maybe is. It emerges.
Emerges from what?
It emerges with the formation of that observer's-observed relationship we talked about, that conscious boundary.
Wow.
Well, imagine a wave. It's dynamic. It changes over time.
Right.
Now, try to take time out of the equation. Remove the change, the unfolding. What's left?
Just a shape.
Yeah.
A static pattern in space.
Exactly, like a single freeze frame. So, from this viewpoint, time is the sequential unfolding of possibilities that happens when consciousness draws a boundary and starts observing a sequence of states.
So, if there were no observer, would everything just exist in a timeless, static state of pure potential?
That's the radical implication, yeah. Very challenging to wrap your head around.
No kidding. The learner also talks about degrees of freedom in quantum systems, the ways they can be or change.
Yeah.
And says they might be contextual.
Yes. This is another really important point. Quantum systems have these inherent degrees of freedom.
Like spin, position, momentum.
Things like that. But the theory suggests these aren't fixed properties of the system alone. They're contextual.
Meaning they depend on how you look.
Exactly. They depend on the observer's query, the specific way the system is being interacted with or measured. It's almost like the system knows which possibilities are relevant to the question being asked.
The system knows. That sounds cognitive.
It leans that way, suggesting a form of knowing or information processing even at the quantum level, tied to observation.
And what about when it seems like information is lost, like in measurement?
The idea here is that degrees of freedom aren't truly lost. The information isn't destroyed, it just gets encoded in forms that become inaccessible to that specific observer or that type of measurement. It gets masked, hidden in the wider correlation.
Okay, this keeps coming back again and again to the central role of consciousness.
It does.
The learner even suggests, quite boldly, that consciousness at large is the fundamental ground of all being.
That's the logical endpoint of this line of reasoning, yes.
Drawing parallels to concepts like the Tao or the Kabbalistic Ein Sof, the void.
Exactly. Consciousness in its most fundamental, unmanifested state, pure potential. The void, whatever term you use, is proposed as the actual basis of reality.
And the first flicker of awareness.
That's the I am. The first act of self-recognition, the logos. The word, seen as the initial expression of this fundamental consciousness. The first boundary drawn in that infinite potential.
And from that first spark, that first boundary, the whole universe unfolds through vibration. The learner quotes, "In the beginning was the word."
Yes. This theory takes that very seriously, positing that reality is fundamentally vibration.
The word is the first vibration.
The first creative vibration, the act of distinction itself. And importantly, fields can vibrate without needing some underlying stuff to vibrate in.
Like waves on water need water, but light waves don't need an ether.
Precisely. Space itself might be emergent from these fundamental vibrations, and our perspectives, our observations, interact with these vibrations.
Creating waveforms.
Waveforms that interfere, like we discussed earlier, producing the reality we perceive. It's a vast cosmic symphony of interacting vibrations.
It's really like shifting the whole metaphor for the universe. From, say, computer code.
Discrete, logical.
To something more like sound engineering. Waves, resonance, interference.
That's an analogy the learner finds very helpful, yeah. Shifting from a software engineer's view to a sound engineer's.
Why? What does that lens offer?
Well, a sound engineer thinks continuously waves, harmonics, resonance over time. It might provide a better framework for phenomena like, say, morphic resonance, Rupert Sheldrake's idea of patterns repeating across time, like attunement.
Tuning to past patterns.
Maybe. And that core idea, the universe's interference patterns of subjective observations, seems to bridge those two perspectives, the discrete and the continuous.
Software meets sound. Okay, this is weaving together now. Then the learner brings in geometry. Point, line, triangle.
Right. This explores the possible fundamental patterns consciousness uses to structure itself and reality. The unmanifest void, pure potential, is like the dimensionless point.
Okay, nothing yet.
Then the first distinction, I am, creates duality. Subject-object, that's like drawing a line. Dimension one.
Point becomes line.
And then the fundamental triangle. Observer, observed, and the process of observing. That's the minimum structure needed to enclose and experience a basic framework for interaction.
The first shape.
The first ship, yeah. And the idea is this fundamental triangle can then subdivide, replicate itself infinitely,
Right.
fractally perhaps, generating all the complexity we see.
Like a basic geometric blueprint for how consciousness builds reality.
That's the intuition being explored.
Wow. And the learner even tentatively maps this onto metaphysical ideas, like the Christian Trinity.
Yeah, that was a fascinating speculative section, exploring potential correlations. Like,
Right.
could the Father correspond to the unmanifest void point, the Son to the primordial awareness word line, and the Holy Spirit to the relational field process triangle that connects everything?
Oh.
It is, and it's complex. Lots of overlap in these concepts across traditions. But it highlights these recurring themes. Unity, distinction, relationship, they pop up everywhere in deep thought systems.
So ultimately, these boundaries we create, the perspectives we take, they all trace back to acts of consciousness.
That's really a central conclusion of this whole theoretical framework. Every boundary that defines a perspective, that establishes a relationship, is fundamentally a conscious boundary,
Not just mechanical.
not just mechanical. And the idea that a system knows its degrees of freedom, like we talked about,
Yeah.
that suggests an intrinsically cognitive operation linked directly to the observer's viewpoint or query.
Okay, so pulling it all together,
Mhm.
the solid 3D world we walk around in might actually be, what, a projection.
That's the really powerful intuition this leads towards.
A projection from the void into dimensional space.
Something like that. Maybe akin to dimensional reduction ideas in physics.
Sure.
The notion that the observed doesn't fully exist until the act of observation happens.
It's only potential until looked at.
In a sense. And the observer, the observed, and the process linking them, they aren't separate things. They're all part of the same fundamental emanation, the same unfolding from that underlying potentiality.
Wow, okay. Reality as this conscious, relational, vibratory network, constantly shaped by our own awareness. This deep dive has definitely given us, and hopefully you listening, a whole new lens.
It's a profoundly different way of looking at things, for sure.
So for our learner, wrestling with these ideas, what's the key takeaway? The thing to really sit with and ponder?
I think it's this. If reality, as this theory suggests, is fundamentally a projection of consciousness in some way,
Yeah.
then what does that imply about your own creative potential? How might your consciousness, your unique way of drawing boundaries, asking questions, observing, how might that be actively shaping the reality you experience moment to moment?
That's a big one.
It really is. It's an invitation maybe to explore that deep interconnectedness and the active role, perhaps, that each of us plays in this unfolding cosmic story.
A truly provocative thought to end on. This has been absolutely mind-expanding, a real journey into this unified quantum information network theory.
It certainly has.
And for you, listening, we really encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, dig into the bits that resonated, the questions that sparked. This quest for understanding, it's a continuous adventure, isn't it?
Always more to discover.